Does it ever feel like the world is just moving at a pace you can't quite keep up with?
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
all these massive forces, technology, global politics, economic shifts, they're driving everything, and it's just hard to even grasp what's really happening.
You're definitely not alone in feeling that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the feeling that brings us here to the deep dive.
Exactly. Our mission in these deep dives is to take a stack of information, the research, the articles, the notes you've shared with us, and really, well, dig into it.
Yeah, unpack it.
To find those key insights, those surprising nuggets of knowledge, the things that help us actually make sense of all the complexity.
And today we're diving into material drawn significantly from Yuval Noah Harari's book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century.
Okay.
We're exploring some of the major challenges this source presents as facing humanity right now and trying to understand what they could mean for you.
So the core idea we're starting with, based on this material, is that the old stories, the frameworks we've used to understand the world, things like traditional liberalism, nationalism, even religion, they seem to be under immense strain.
Yeah, perhaps even facing a crisis.
Right.
And this crisis, the source argues, is happening precisely at a time when humankind is facing the biggest, most complex challenges it ever have.
Challenges that are often global technological.
Exactly. And the existing narratives might simply not be equipped to help us navigate them.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Where does the source point as the sort of the main engine of this change, this feeling that the world is being fundamentally reshaped?
The material really focuses on what it calls the twin revolutions,
Yeah.
Infotech and Biotech.
Infotech and Biotech.
Yeah, it frames them as potentially the biggest challenges our species has ever encountered. The central concern isn't just these fields individually, but their potential merger.
That combination, information technology and biotechnology. What's the specific fear there, according to the source?
Well, the source lays out a pretty stark picture. That this merger could push billions of humans out of the job market
Billions. Wow.
and create a massive new useless class. Now, you hear debate around this. Is this just another wave of, Luddite hysteria, like fears during the Industrial
Or was
Revolution?
something fundamentally different happening this time?
And the argument presented is that this time is different.
Why? What's the reasoning?
Yes, and the reasoning is compelling. It's not just that machines can do physical labor anymore. The source points out that AI is becoming capable of outperforming humans even in cognitive skills.
Cognitive skills, like intuition.
Exactly. In areas we thought required uniquely human intuition.
Because what we call intuition is often just really sophisticated pattern recognition, isn't it?
Precisely.
And algorithms are just getting better at that than we are.
That's the idea. Think about navigating traffic, identifying financial risks, or spotting legal precedents. Our brains do this by pattern matching. And algorithms, fueled by vast amounts of data and advances in neuroscience and behavioral economics, they can identify these biochemical patterns.
Biochemical patterns, like what?
Analyzing facial expressions, tone of voice, even subtle physiological cues to potentially hack humans.
Hack humans.
Understand and predict our emotions and choices in ways we barely understand ourselves.
So it's not just about automating physical tasks anymore. It's about potentially automating us, our decisions, our intuition.
That's the argument being put forward. And AI has capabilities humans simply don't have in the same way. The source highlights connectivity and updatability.
Right. Humans are mostly isolated entities. It's hard to connect all of us and update our knowledge at the same time.
But computers in a network can function as, well, almost a single entity.
Okay.
The example used is self-driving cars. You're not comparing one human driver to one AI car.
You're comparing a collection of humans.
Exactly. A collection of human drivers who learn individually to an integrated network of AI cars where a lesson learned by one car can instantly update the entire fleet.
Ah, I see. That collective learning, that instantaneous coordination, that's the game changer.
It really is. And this fundamentally shifts where authority lies, potentially. The idea that algorithms could give you better counsel than human feelings? The source explores this possibility that authority could shift from humans to computers. It raises the question, could algorithms eventually make the most important decisions in life?
Like what to study, where to work, who to marry.
Yeah. I mean, we already rely on algorithms for movie recommendations or navigation.
True. Netflix, Google Maps.
So the thought experiment is thrown out there.
Yeah.
Imagine a character like Anna Karenina, paralyzed by indecision, asking a Facebook algorithm for relationship advice.
It sounds absurd. But you can see the trend line, maybe.
Where could it lead? That's the question.
And the flip side of this concentration of algorithmic power, what's the danger there?
The potential for digital dictatorships. The source suggests algorithms could concentrate power in a tiny elite who control the data and the networks,
Leaving most people.
leading to a future where the majority suffers not from being exploited for their labor, but from simply being deemed irrelevant.
Irrelevance. That feels like a uniquely 21st century fear, doesn't it? Even in the harshest industrial past, workers were exploited, sure, but they were needed.
That's a key distinction the source makes. In the 20th century, whether in the USSR, Nazi Germany, or the US, propaganda often depicted the common person, the worker, the farmer, the soldier, as the hero of the future.
They felt vital even if things were terrible.
Exactly. They felt vital. Now, hearing terms like globalization, blockchain, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, many ordinary people feel these aren't really about them.
Like the future is being built, but they're just spectators.
Or worse, potential surplus.
Yeah.
And the source links this feeling of irrelevance to current political upheaval.
Populist movements like Brexit or the rise of Trump.
Yes, interpreting them not just as traditional revolts against exploitation, but potentially as a cry against this perceived irrelevance, a rebellion against an elite who, well, doesn't need them anymore.
And the source suggests this might be a losing battle.
It posits that, yeah,
Yeah.
because fighting irrelevance is fundamentally harder than fighting exploitation. You can strike against a boss who needs your labor, but how do you make yourself needed by an algorithm?
That is a chilling thought. And despite these potentially society-redefining technological shifts, the source notes that this isn't even, like, the top item on the political agenda.
Right. Looking back at the 2016 U.S. election, the focus was on emails and walls.
Not the massive job impact of automation.
That disconnect is highlighted, and it brings us to the other major global existential threats discussed in the material. Threats that nationalism alone seems, well, ill-equipped to handle.
Okay, like what? Nuclear war is still presented as a threat, even though recent decades have been relatively peaceful, statistically speaking.
Yeah, violence causing only around 1% of deaths globally today compared to 5% in the 20th century is a huge drop.
But the tension is rising again.
That's the concern. The source argues that nuclear weapons have made World War collective suicide, basically a high-damage, low-profit endeavor.
Makes sense.
And cyber warfare complicates this, making retaliation almost instantaneous. But even if it's irrational.
Human stupidity, the march of folly.
Exactly, we can't rule it out entirely. The events in Crimea are cited as a frightening omen.
Okay, and then there's the ecological crisis, climate change.
Which is framed as a present reality, unlike the potential future of nuclear war.
It's happening now.
Yes, the source accepts the scientific consensus on human-caused climate change, pointing to rising temperatures, sea levels, extreme weather, the likelihood of mass refugees.
And the absolute necessity for global action here, that comes through strongly.
This is crucial. The source is clear. Individual countries are just not sovereign when facing climate change.
Right. Your body can go carbon neutral and still drown if others don't act.
Exactly. Chad can be 100% solar powered and still become a desert. And different national interests create friction. Some predict Russia could benefit from warming. Fossil fuel exporters clash with importers.
You see that tension playing out.
The example of the U.S. imposing solar panel tariffs is used to illustrate how short-term national interests can override global needs. And the source observes that skepticism about climate change is often linked to the nationalist right.
So these aren't isolated problems. Technological disruption, global threats, they sort of feed into each other, don't they?
They're deeply interconnected.
Yeah.
Competition over resources exacerbated by climate change could increase conflict risk.
While nationalistic competition hinders global cooperation on AI or climate action.
Precisely. Which leads us to the internal challenges we face, navigating this intensely complex world.
And the source's framing of immigration is particularly insightful here, presenting it as a kind of deal.
Yeah, a deal with 3 implicit terms and 4 points of debate. It's a useful way to kind of cut through the emotion and see the underlying tensions.
Okay, what are the terms?
So, term 1, the host country lets immigrants in. Term 2, immigrants assimilate to some degree. Term 3, assimilated immigrants are accepted as full and equal members.
Simple enough on the surface, but the debates start right away with term 1, right? Is letting immigrants in a moral duty or more like a favor?
Exactly. On one side, the argument for a moral duty, especially towards refugees, and the practical point that illegal immigration is almost impossible to stop, creating this vulnerable underclass.
And the other side.
The argument that a nation has a right to protect its borders, preserve its culture, and that accepting immigrants is a favor, allowing the host country to pick and choose, maybe based on skills or even religion.
The source notes the hypocrisy, too, like wanting cheap temporary labor but refusing long-term status.
Like the Qatar example, yeah.
Yeah.
Leading to potential hierarchical societies.
And the second debate, how much assimilation is enough? This feels like a big one.
Huge. Should immigrants from more patriarchal societies adopt feminist values? From religious societies embrace secularism, abandon traditional dress or food norms?
It gets complicated fast.
Pro-immigrationists might argue that Europe is already diverse, and liberal values mean tolerance for different lifestyles, as long as core laws are followed. They might ask, do you expect a Muslim immigrant in the UK to become Christian when many native Brits aren't?
Whereas anti-immigrationists often demand a higher standard.
Often closer to an idealized, maybe even imaginary, national identity.
Okay, debate 3. How quickly should assimilated immigrants be fully accepted?
Those advocating for immigrants push for rapid acceptance. They argue that excluding, say, third-generation citizens who have assimilated is the host country failing the deal, and that causes tension.
But the counter-argument is for patience.
Yeah, that societies take centuries, not just decades, to truly integrate populations. There's that eucalyptus tree analogy.
Right, the tree planted in France. From the tree's perspective, it's French. It grew there. But ecologically, it's still an invading species taking generations to integrate.
That analogy really highlights the huge gap between the personal timescale of an individual immigrant and the collective timescale of a society.
And the fourth debate kind of brings it all together. Is the deal actually working at all?
Yeah. Are immigrants failing to assimilate? Term 2. Or is the host country failing to accept them even when they do assimilate? Term 3.
Or maybe both.
The source suggests both failures likely contribute, creating this vicious cycle of suspicion and resentment. And there's the challenge of accounting in the public mind.
What do you mean accounting?
How do you weigh the millions of law-abiding, contributing immigrants against the handful who engage in crime or terrorism? Public perception often fixates on the latter, doesn't it?
That's true. And this ties into the discussion of cultural differences. Moving beyond biological racism, which the source just dismisses as scientifically bankrupt,
Rightly so.
to something it calls culturalism.
Yes, acknowledging that cultural differences do exist and can be significant differences in values, sexual mores, political habits, even how people handle conflict.
And the fictional Cold Gorm Land workplace example illustrates this, how different approaches can clash.
It shows how different cultural approaches to handling disagreements, even if they're perfectly fine in their own context, can cause friction in a shared environment. It can lead to misunderstandings, perceptions of incompetence.
So arguments for culturalism can sometimes seem locally valid.
They can seem that way, but the source immediately dissects the flaws, confusing local norms with objective superiority, overgeneralizing from group statistics to judge individuals, and ignoring individual merit.
It's complex. Should a firm consider cultural factors if they impact job performance? Does that justify discrimination? Or does it mean we need affirmative action to bridge those gaps?
Incredibly tricky territory, as you say. And terrorism is another area where, the source argues, our internal reaction is absolutely key.
It's framed less as a military threat in itself and more as a lesson in perception.
Exactly. Terrorism is described as a military strategy for the weak, one that relies on fear rather than by causing material damage.
The power comes from the disproportionate reaction it causes.
Yes, the astounding disproportion between the actual violence and the terror it inspires.
When you look at the statistics, the source provides deaths from terrorism are tiny compared to traffic accidents, diabetes, or air pollution.
Tiny. Yet we fear it far more than sugar or cars.
Why is that?
The source uses the analogy of a fly in a china shop. The terrorist can't actually break anything much.
But it can annoy a bull.
It buzzes in the ear of a bull of the state and makes the bull smash the entire shop. Terrorists provoke powerful enemies into overreacting and causing far more damage to themselves and their own society than the terrorist ever could.
So counterterrorism needs to be as much about managing public fear and political reaction
as it is about traditional security measures, thinking like theater producers as well as generals, as the source puts it.
Right.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
And the core message is powerful. Nothing the terrorists do can defeat us. We are the only ones who can defeat ourselves if we overreact.
Wow.
The source identifies 3 fronts in this struggle: the political, the state promising security, the media, which amplifies the
Right,
drama.
that's third.
And most importantly, the imagination of each and every one of us, our own inner terror, is what they exploit.
The 9/11 example highlights this perfectly, the symbolic towers versus the militarily significant Pentagon.
The attack on the towers had immense audiovisual impact, feeding the theater of terror. It's far more deeply etched in public memory than the Pentagon attack, even though the Pentagon was arguably a more significant military target.
It makes the distinction really clear. Current terrorism is largely theater designed to provoke.
But future threats involving WMDs or sophisticated cyber attacks could be existentially serious and require different, more rational responses.
Assuming we don't defeat ourselves through panic first.
Exactly.
So all these challenges, the tech revolution reshaping jobs and power, the global threats of climate and conflict, these internal struggles with identity, culture, fear, they just underscore how incredibly complex the world has become.
And the source explicitly states that no single person can possibly understand it all.
Which brings us to the search for meaning and truth in this complex, often confusing landscape. The source challenges a core idea often found in liberal thought, this absolute trust in the rational individual.
Yeah, it suggests this might be a chauvinistic Western fantasy, even scientifically flawed, because our decisions are so heavily influenced by emotions, heuristics, group dynamics.
The idea that individuality, too, is a myth when it comes to thinking.
Yes, we think in groups. It takes a tribe to raise a child, the source argues, and it takes a tribe to solve complex problems or even invent things.
But the challenge is we have global problems, but our default tribes, nations, religions are still focused on their own interests.
They don't form a global community equipped to think collectively about global issues.
And this confusion is made worse by what's often called the era of post-truth. But the source argues this isn't necessarily new, is it?
Some fake news lasts forever, the source states, pretty provocatively.
Comparing belief in religious stories for millennia, often with zero scientific evidence, to modern fake news.
Just on a vastly different time scale and scale of belief, yeah.
So fiction, while it can be fake news, also has immense power for good.
Absolutely. The source immediately pivots to highlight that fiction is among the most effective tools in humanity's toolkit for enabling large-scale cooperation.
Hospitals, armies, cathedrals, legal systems.
They all rely on shared beliefs and abstract fictions. It points out our uniquely human ability to know and not to know at the same time.
Like with money or nations or sports teams.
We know money is just paper, a nation is an invention, but we act as if they are deeply real and meaningful.
This creates a fundamental dilemma, doesn't it? Especially for anyone seeking understanding. Do you serve power, which often relies on fictions for unity, or truth, which can sometimes be disruptive?
Humans prefer power to truth, is the stark conclusion drawn from the source material. We're often more interested in gaining control over the world than understanding it.
But navigating the 21st century demands that we do try to distinguish reality from fiction, doesn't it? Not everything is equally true or fake.
Crucially, underneath all the fake news, there are real facts and real suffering, the source insists.
The suffering caused by beliefs in fictions, violence born of extreme nationalism or religious fundamentalism, that's very real.
Very real. We must strive even harder to distinguish reality from fiction. The source suggests criteria like trusting Churchill more than Stalin or the NYT more than Pravda, despite their flaws, because they operate under different constraints regarding factual reporting.
And ultimately, the responsibility lands on us as individuals to check our sources, uncover biases.
Yes, to invest time and effort in uncovering our biases and verifying our sources. We can't verify everything, sure, but we have a responsibility to scrutinize the sources we choose to trust.
The source circles back to how fictional stories provide us with meaning and identity, and how rituals, the hocus pocus, make them feel real.
And sacrifices are also key, strengthening faith, substituting for failing to live up to ideals. There's that example of the person who engages in tax fraud but feels pious for donating to build a temple or something.
And the idea of an identity portfolio holding multiple, even contradictory beliefs simultaneously.
Like the Tea Party supporter, squaring belief in Jesus, supporting welfare programs, and owning guns. It shows how complex and not always logically consistent our internal worlds can be.
So given all this confusion, all these competing narratives, where can you possibly find stable ground, a truer understanding?
The source offers a compelling perspective here, that maybe all big stories are fictions generated by our own minds.
And perhaps the big question facing humans isn't what is the meaning of life, but rather how do we get out of suffering?
That's the pivot. When you let go of the need to cling to national, religious, or ideological fictions for identity and meaning, maybe you can observe reality more clearly.
And the argument is that observing suffering is the best place to start understanding reality and identity.
Because unlike abstract national or religious concepts, suffering is 100% real.
Contrasting the abstract metaphorical suffering of a nation with the very real physical and emotional suffering of, say, a woman in Warsaw who's been robbed and raped.
Exactly. The source warns against politicians and leaders using mystical, abstract words like sacrifice, eternity, purity, redemption to disguise or excuse real suffering in the name of some fictional entity.
This brings us back to the idea that maybe a dose of humility is the best antidote to human stupidity, especially in cooling down tensions driven by feelings of national or cultural superiority.
And the source ends this thread with a powerful call to action, almost a ratio. For every dollar and minute we invest in advancing artificial intelligence.
We should invest $1 in a minute in advancing human consciousness.
Right.
We had better understand our minds before the algorithms make our minds up for us. That feels like both a warning and a fundamental challenge for navigating this century.
It really highlights the danger, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Powerful external technology paired with what the source calls the natural stupidity of humans if we don't cultivate self-awareness and critical thinking.
So we've taken quite a deep dive into this complex material. We've explored the potential transformation and disruption driven by infotech and biotech, the feeling of irrelevance it can breed,
The looming global threats of climate change and conflict.
and the internal struggles we face with immigration, cultural identity, and the manipulative nature of fear. We've seen how the source argues that our existing frameworks, our old stories, may not be enough to cope.
And how navigating this confusion requires actively seeking truth, distinguishing reality from fiction, and confronting suffering.
It's a challenging picture, presenting a world grappling with unprecedented technological power, ecological limits, geopolitical tensions.
In our own deep-seated internal biases and fears.
And the source suggests that confronting these challenges effectively requires not just global cooperation, which is incredibly difficult,
But also a profound individual effort to understand the world, and perhaps even more importantly, to understand ourselves.
given the incredible speed at which technology is evolving, its power to shape our future, the scale of the global threats we face, and the author's argument that we need to understand our own minds before algorithms understand and manipulate them. Here's a thought to leave you with as you reflect on all this. What is the single most important deep dive you can undertake right now in your own life to truly prepare yourself for the 21st century?